Well, we seem to have some technical issues, but needless to say, we are live from what my indications are here. We're talking about the pain points, we're talking about power, history, and the political fault lines in specifically the colored communities. Hoping that our other guest, Patrick Mellett, will join us in a moment. He's of course the historian and author. He joined me earlier, and he's just going to give us some historical context to why we are talking about coloreds, talk about his work that he's done. But there's obviously a broader discussion that's to be had this evening. Let me just add the other guest as well, Professor Stanley Petersen, and he represents the Koisan communities, and we'll get his input in a moment. Welcome to this discussion. Thank you for the overwhelming response when I posted that we were going to do this evening. It's quite a long discussion. I'm going to allow you to participate and to give your opinion, but I'm going to ask you to please remain respectful of differing views of my guests and also opinions in the chat. There's going to be an opportunity for you to raise questions, concerns that you might have. I just want to please ask you to remain respectful. We are hoping to have this discussion for about 2 hours. My other guests are political analysts Angelo Fick, Thomas de Blanche, and Dr. Calvin Knowles. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me this evening and joining us on Facebook, on LinkedIn, also on YouTube Live. An important discussion to have, an important discussion because we see that there are a lot of tensions, not only in the colored community, but specifically in South Africa. And I'm hoping that we're going to get back to author Patrick Mellett, just to give us some background to the history and the identity issues, because he, in his work, says we are neither coloreds nor people of color, but we are Africans, specifically Kamisa Africans, and is going to hopefully give us some context to that, because it is important to understand where you're going if you know where you come from. Let me just first ask you, Stanley, you can hear me clearly, right?
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
All right, why do the Khoisan communities have a problem calling themselves colored? Because you've taken a definite stance where that is concerned.
Yes, thank you, Lynette. Lynette, it's very simple. In our opinion, there's no people called colored. Remember, before 1950, South Africa were only governed by 29 laws. Now, in 1950, they established a 30th Act, Act number 30 of 1950, that classified all so-called Griquas, Nama, Korana, and San people as colored. And then in 1991, the then PW, he scrapped that act. In other words, the colors have been an act. Before that, we were the Khoi and the San people. Remember, it's very important for the people of South Africa, especially the colored community, to know they are the descendants of us. The reason why they come up with this act is to strip them from the identity, is to strip them from the lands and everything. So now we cannot claim lands, we cannot claim anything because we are coloreds. We are a nation that the government established, and there's no color. It's a simple thing. And that's why the fear when we rise up now and said we are the Khoi and the San people. That is simple, and it's our simple answer. We are distinct from the other people because we are indigenous. We are the first indigenous people in South Africa, and that is undisputable. So that is where it comes to. Government currently has Act number 3 of 2019, which say that the Griqua, the Nama, the Korana, the Cape Khoi, and the San, those communities are now being recognized by an act. So that's why we are distinct from being a colored. But we applaud the people that's activists.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you. So, when this discussion and debate about who is colored or colored identity or the future of coloreds and those that feel marginalized, when that is on the table, you don't feel that you are comfortable enough to speak on behalf of, or it's not your issue. Help me to understand where you stand on that.
Let me just give you in South Africa a very practical experience. Currently, I'm the main negotiator for Khoi people for ABS levies. In other words, people that use rooibos, scalitium, buchu, and those kind of things. And the benefits of that is only for Khoi people, not coloreds. That's we are clear there. So if you want to benefit from that, you must say you are a Khoi person, not a colored. Because remember, if we don't do that, Lynette, if we don't stand up, we as the Khoi Rooibos Biodiversity Trust, we establish now a national Nama forum. We established a national Griqua forum. We established national Korana forum. We're busy now with the Cape Koi. We already established a metro. We're now going to KCSD. So those are the communities that we told South Africa and the president, the benefits are for them. Because remember, if we said it's now open for free for all, like for a colored, then a person that married to a colored or anybody, they will get the benefits. And in South Africa, we as Khoi and San, we don't benefit. We are BE, we have been classified colored and black, but we're nowhere. That's why to this is a practical example that I want to give to you by saying we are proud to know who we are. That is a simple explanation for me for you to give.
Thank you so much. Quickly from your side, Angelo, Thomas, Calvin, I don't know if you want to specifically respond quickly before I say goodbye to Stanley on the points that he has raised.
If I may,
Please
if I
go
may,
ahead, Calvin.
I've been, in my mind at least, what's mulling in my mind is that when I look at this whole conundrum, maybe I shouldn't use the word conundrum because conundrum is almost like referring to the issue as that of a sort of insurmountable issue. It's a thorny issue. Yes, there's no doubt about that. But for me, and I want to thank Stanley for giving us that sort of background. But from where I stand, and I wrote an opinion piece for a paper recently, where I wrote about Liam Jacobs' defection from the DA to the PA,
Mm.
because a lot has been said about that. And for me, the word or the concept that I've used there was that we are dealing here with, when we look at the political issue where we are now, the real politic of a people of where they were and where they are now. And for me, it's all good and well that we talk about this very complex issue in historical terms, obviously. And I think that's where Patrick will come in, with his prolific work that is, his literary works that's of course out there. That gives us that perspective, because we need to know where we are coming from. But I think there's been an overall, again, that's my opinion, that is almost like a pussyfooting in terms of a future focus. And for me, it is a people that were there, they are here now. Where are they going? And I do not want a conversation to go to the level of it merely being an academic exercise on the one hand, but really to for people to understand, and that is from my side again, and I will reiterate it throughout the conversation that we're having here now. That is, this is my opinion. This is how I feel about things. Is that we need to realize and admit that we are in a situation that's very real for the people that's affected by it, and we need a way forward. I do not know necessarily how it will be done, but yeah, for me, I don't want it to be an academic exercise or conversation necessarily, but at the end of the day, I'd like to see sort of a pragmatic conversation unfolding here tonight. That, yeah, so that's my 2 cents worth.
Yeah, I'm also glad that we are able to do this, but I also don't, it's not my style of another talk shop because if we just reiterate the same objections, the same insecurities, the same fears, and the same narratives, we cannot make progress. We are not providing solutions, but we have to create a platform where it is heard, voiced, acknowledged, and then we can't decide for people what they must do. Certainly, we cannot say that the coloreds are one big collective and they all think and speak and act in the same manner. Thank you for
Yeah.
joining us this evening, Patrick. I really appreciate your limited time. You, historian, you're author, your work speaks and argues that we are neither coloreds nor people of color, but Africans, specifically Kamisa Africans. Help us to understand the historical roots of that identity. Why this name or this term reference matters and cuts so deeply.
Look, I think the first thing for me to say is it's not for me or anyone else to prescribe to other people what they call themselves or how they see themselves. So I can only say how I see myself, and I can try and give you the historical journey to why I see myself in this kind of way. Now, I think what a lot of people don't seem to understand or know is that actually nobody was classified colored. What you had was three categories. And this was established not in 1950, it was established in 1911 for the first time when the Union of South Africa was formed. And those categories then was European, which later on became white, Native, which later on became Bantu and then became Black in 1977 when P.W. Botha did the switch. And then, of course, there was the category colored. But that category changed in 1950 when 7 classifications were introduced. So from 1950, nobody was classified colored. You were classified Cape colored, whether you lived in the Cape, ever saw the Cape, whatever part of the country, you were a Cape colored. Then you were a Malay colored, you were Chinese colored, you were an Indian colored, you were an other colored like me, you were an other Asiatic, and you were a Griqua colored. So these were the classifications. Now, if you go back to 1911, when they actually first introduced this term colored, there was a whole lot of categories in the 1904 census, like Masbiker, like Yildamara, Turk. And what they did was they took a whole conglomeration of peoples. Now, that they didn't only do this with the people that they classified colored, they also did it with the people that they classified native. There were over 100 different societies, African societies, that were suddenly panel beaten into 9 linguistic nations. And this was collectively categorized as native. When you go to the 1904 census, you had people who were enumerated as Hottentots, as Bushmen, as Griqua, as Korana, as Damara, and so on and so on. So what happens in 1911 is basically social engineering. Park that for 1 second. How did people self-identify before that? Now, we can go back, and by the way, they didn't self-identify as Khoi and as San. These were Europeans made these words and overlaid it. So we got to, and Koisan was a terrible word that a German guy who was participant in a genocide against the Kung and the Nama, he created this word only in 1928 in his writings, Leonard Schulze-Jenner. When we go back, we find that the first people that emerged as a mix of Khoi and also of African Asian enslaved began to call themselves Africans for the first time in the 1600s in the 1690s, Ouderam Afrikaner. And from this, the Oorlam Afrikaners came about, which was a dynasty that has gone on right through to today. So African was a self-identifying term before anybody else used it. Then there was another term, free black. The term colored comes in around about 1865, but it doesn't mean what it means today. It meant what they talked about was the British colored people of South Africa. And that included Xhosa, Tswana, Sotho, Koisan, etc., etc. Anybody that was not white was a British colored person. The term evolves in 1911 into something different. And in 1950, even something even more different. So let me point out two other aspects of self-identification. The first political organization that was established by descendants, mixed descendants of Khoi and African Asian enslaved, was in Kimberley in 1880. And it was called the Kimberley African League. The next organization was in 1902. It was called the African Political Organization. It later on changed its name to African People's Organization. And it's got a history in the Pan-African Association that was established by a woman from Kimberley, together with an advocate from Ghana, from Trinidad, when the first Pan-African Association was formed in 1898. The African National Congress, by the way, wasn't called the African National Congress. It only adopted the term African in 1923, when it changed its name from the South African Native National Congress, and it followed the lead of the APO. So there was a time that our people self-identified and called themselves Africans. And I prefer this because we are part of a bigger African family in South Africa and in the continent. So for myself, who can be proud of being an other colored? And you know what that meant? Because there was, if you go back and you read the Act, it's got some very strange stuff. It's as clear as mud. It says that a colored person is a white person if they have married somebody that isn't a white person. You go back and look at the Act. It makes this statement. So you had a scenario in 1950 that there was about 35,000 people who were in appearance white, but they were living amongst colored people, married to colored people, and so on. So they had to create something. But there was also people who would later be classified black, about 500,000 or 500,000, who were also black colored people. So you had white colored and you had black colored. Do you see what we're wrestling with? And yes. Today, when a person says, let's say from the Northern Cape, starts talking to me like I'm a white person because I don't look like them, so I'm therefore not a colored. Then another person, I always use this example, first election. There's a journalist and he's interviewing a man in Lavender Hill. The man is black in complexion. His name is Kafachi Swart. And he's asked, who are you going to vote for? And he says, ek gaan stem vir die man met die bles, for de Klerk. And the journalist says, why? He says, ek wil nie hê dat 'n kaffer langs aan my moet bly. So he uses this term in a different way to his own name even. He uses it in this derogatory sense and distancing himself. So we are wrestling with something really difficult here. For me, what I have said is I want to find a way of expressing my ancestral cultural heritage, because there are people, there is a community and communities who have this history of Khoi, San, African Asian enslaved, indentured laborers, and we are the descendants. You can't wish this away. But how do you talk about it positively? And the way that I talk about it positively, I look at water as being the lifeblood of humanity. Without water, we die. And when we look at migration in Africa, we see that it happened along waterways. And the old San and the old Khoi word for water was chamis or amakwa. And we know that the first queer traders with the Europeans self-identified by saying that they were Kamisans, Watermans. And the Kamisa water system in Cape Town that still runs underground, that gives me a sense of saying it's not a color, it's not a race, it's not an ethnicity, but it speaks to who I am. I'm an African, and I have a specific culture that's rooted in my mix of Khwe, of African Asian enslaved, and of European. And so I can positively project who I am. But whenever anybody actually asks me, who are you? You know, what are you? That's how they say it. What are you? I say, I am a person that is born of people who rose above adversity. And it's my opening line. And my closing line is, and I'm proudly Kamisa African. So it's a different way of thinking. I'm not prescribing this, that everybody must follow what I'm saying, but it's a way that I have found. And I think we've got to give people the space to find ways of expressing them. Some people say, well, I'm queer. I'm Griqua, I'm Khorana. That's all legitimate. The real point here is, should the state be categorizing and classifying people? And I believe it should not. I believe that people have the right to self-identify. And if somebody says to me, I self-identify as a colored person, I'm not going to argue with them about that. But I will argue that the state has no right to be labeling and classifying and creating laws based on what the Rome Statute calls a crime against humanity. That's what race classification is. It's in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, yet our government still does this. So for me, those are the important issues.
So how have the apartheid laws, like the Registration Act that we saw, the Separate Development Immorality Act, all of that policing of policies and the way people relate to one another, has that entrenched these divisions that we see today? Was that the introduction of why we hold on to some identity and have veered off from self-identifying, that we've literally played into those categorizations?
What apartheid did was it othered. It created a culture of othering. And it used a particular vehicle to do this. You know, by the way, the ideology wasn't called apartheid. It was called Christian nationalism. Apartheid was the nickname for it. And it is this Christian nationalism, another name for it is Christian Zionism. It's and it believed that God ordained it, that people should be separate, that they should think of themselves as separate nations. And we see this wicked idea actually becoming popular again. People calling themselves First Nations and so on, and this kind of thing. I mean, the concept of nation is a European idea. It's fairly modern. There's no way that San and Khwe people ever thought of themselves as nations as such. The notion of first, based on a European doctrine of terra nullius, the empty land. So we see these ideas of Favut coming up again in our society, but it's all about setting apart and othering. And people were indoctrinated at school, in their churches. The Dutch Reformed Church, the evangelical churches, the Pentecostal churches, they all push this Christian nationalism of separate and othering. How we get out of this is not going to be by magic. It's not going to go away on its own. And this is where government has failed. It's failed to deal with, after the Second World War, Germany and France banned Nazi parties. They banned the ideology. They banned the symbolism and so on. I often say to people, what happened in 1994 is that we took old wine and poured it into new wineskins. And the science of that is that the wineskins will cause the new wine to sour, and it would finally also burst. And this is what we are experiencing. We haven't dealt with the issue of othering. We haven't dealt with the ideology of Christian nationalism, which was shorthanded as apartheid. And it's alive and it's well. And because of government failures and corruption and all of this kind of thing, the whole liberation struggle has been tainted. And all of this is being presented now as, you see, we were always right. We're not dealing with it. And it's dangerous. We have scenarios. We had 2 incidents here in the Cape, in Cape Town over the last couple of years, where you had a school in Pinelands where the kids were doing, and encouraged by their teachers, a mock slavery sale of slaves. And the darker, more people who would be classified as black were being sold by people who were classified as colored in the school. And it happened in the school near me here as well, where they actually gave chocolates as prizes for the people who had produced the best adverts for slaves. Something's wrong. Something's really wrong. And the fact is that we also stopped teaching history at school. So we don't tell people, what is memory? History is memory. And if we don't deal with restorative memory, we're going to have distorted memory. And this is where the thing colored comes in. People don't know what it actually meant. They don't know about those 7 categories. If I tell an average person on the Cape Flats that a Chinese person was colored and an Indian person was colored, they'll tell me I'm talking nonsense. But those were the classifications.
But now we see with the discussion about BEE, that came into play where a lot of colored people said, how can Chinese be colored? Why do they qualify for the same kind of privileges that's meant for blacks and coloreds and everyone else?
And Chinese have been in South Africa since 1658, just like everybody else. And in fact, in Cape Town, a lot of people don't know. Names like Fortune originally were Fortune. It was a Chinese name. There's so many, Watson, Chinese name. But because people don't know the history, they don't know who we are, what our cultural heritage is, and the struggles that we went through. For instance, if you talk to many people who are classified black, they will say, well, colored people never ever had passes. There was no pass laws for colored people. The reality is that the pass laws were longer in place and actually more vicious for the ancestors of people of African Asian history as enslaved. If you didn't have your pass, which was a button with a number sewn onto your tunic, you had your nose cut off or your ear cut off or branded on the cheek. For 2nd and 3rd, eventually 4th, cut your tendon on your leg. And that went on for a long time. It was then extended to the Khoi people. And only in the 1800s is it introduced to other Africans in South Africa. We don't know our history. People say, why are you preoccupied with the past? Because the past is not past. The past is in the present. And it's tainting our road into the future. So, when we talk about the subject, it does engender lots of passions and so on. But we must talk about it. We must have national conversations about this, not just amongst people who are classified as colored, but by all South Africans. And in fact, if we go into the history and the roots of all Africans, we will find that amongst the Xhosa, there are clan names, and these clan names are dead giveaways. There's a clan name called the Amaskochis because a Scotsman married into the Amaxhosa, and that clan comes from there. There's the Abelungu, Malungu, a white person. There are white Xhosas. There's Amamolo. When you start to, go into each people, we all have a bit of mix. There's nothing such as a pure black and a pure white, and some people even argue there's a pure colored. I mean, we need to get our heads around this nonsense that we were indoctrinated for so long into, that there's something called purity, and then there is this this othering, and we're not coming to grips with it.
I quickly want to interject and ask you, Angela, when you hear, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with the history that Patrick touches on, why do you think then, Angelo, have these stories or this history been erased or sidelined, that people actually believe we are separate, we don't come from the same roots?
So I think firstly, it's the triumph of colonialism and its extension into apartheid South Africa, its intensification as apartheid. And then I think the failures of the post-apartheid state. I mean, for me, as a child of the Black consciousness period, born in 1972, it was always an understanding that one is a Black South African with the big B, that it is inclusive, that one has family members who speak a variety of languages, that one's ancestors come from varieties of parts on the continent. And as the late child of late children, my parents born in the 1930s, their parents born in the 1890s, we can very quickly go through those categories of Mosbikers. We can quickly place a grandmother in Portuguese East Africa. And so in my family, this notion of being named by an apartheid or colonial categorization has always been something that was resisted, particularly through Black consciousness politics. However, at the end of apartheid, when those older men who'd gone to prison in 1963, the Rivonia trialists, come back out of prison and take leadership positions, they bring back into circulation a whole set of terms and understandings: Mandela, Sisulu, Mbeki, Govan, Mbeki, Andrew Mlangeni. They come out of prison and they start talking as if it's still 1959, as if it's still 1963, as if 1970s Black consciousness didn't happen, as if the United Democratic Front and its particular positions in anti-racism in the 1980s, articulated in South Africa and globally, hadn't happened. And so what you then see in the 1990s is a re-ethnicization of politics and a re-ethnicization of race. And so, people start talking about coloreds again, and they talk about Indians. And this is a world in which, we now have to have a relationship as the post-apartheid state with the Republic of India. So who are these Indians that we're talking about? Are we talking about Indian-descended South Africans? And then, and Patrick is right, when you start looking into the histories, this notion of purity is one that I think very many people cling to because, again, this has been a very uncertain time for very many people. It's a time of greater organizational disaffiliation. People stop belonging to the established churches and religions and find spaces in Pentecostal and startup religions. People increasingly are atomized, so it's them, and particularly after the year 2000, and their little internet connection connecting to various parts of the world via television, and not actually always only talking to people on their block, on their street, in their church, in their trade union. And this is where the term that I find so deeply problematic, which Patrick brought up at the beginning, people of color, comes in, right? It's an American term. It's a term that has a very specific American United States context to be inclusive in a way that it isn't in South Africa, and that I don't even think is in the US. Because when you talk about people of color, white remains the standard, which is never questioned, which is the human standard from which the rest of us are aberrations. And so I think it's important to recognize that it's not just that people haven't been taught this history. The public discourse in this country by its senior politicians, Nelson Mandela, really took us back 20 years from what we had gained between 1970 and 1990, back into the 50s. And political battles that we had won in the mass democratic movement in South Africa were set back because people were re-ethnicizing as if the 1970s didn't happen. The second thing is a very clear post-apartheid failure of education. The teaching of history, the teaching of biology, the teaching of culture. And I don't just mean in the school curriculum, but in public. Next month, we're going to have Heritage Month. What is Heritage Month constructed as? Put on your costume that belongs to your people. If it has beads, that's fantastic. Your language is the thing that you speak and it makes you special. When actually there are, 12 official languages? But try and read a law in any language that is not English. Try and read statutes that is not the Constitution in any language that is not English. Try and have a court process in which One set of people are speaking Chivenda, another set of people are speaking isiXhosa, and see if there is appropriate, proper court interpretation. Watch television programs and you see the subtitles for languages that you understand are so poor that you sort of think that that's not what those characters are saying. So we've engendered a country, I think, in which people have been encouraged to rethink of themselves very much inside the very narrow terms of colonialism and apartheid. And we see this in the rising xenophobic attitudes about who is and who is not a South African. We hear it from politicians when they call Afrikaans a white language, as if we don't have records of, slave descendants and indigenous people writing the Quran in Afrikaans and in Arabic script, writing, those sorts of things, as if the first speakers of Afrikaans are not people at the Cape who are not white. So again, white supremacist experiments of the late 1880s and 1900s to make Afrikaans a white language triumphs. You go into the Hector Peterson Museum, and the first panel that you see is a history of Afrikaans. And it says Afrikaans was born in 1881 at a, language convention. And, you either laugh or you vomit because it's just so enraging, because the census tells us that the language that is most spoken and understood in South Africa, 42% of South Africans follow Afrikaans. The 42% of the country is not white South African, right? So I think for me, it's, again, ascription versus identification. We're always going to be calling one another names. The question is, can those names matter? When the state calls you by a name, it does matter. And this is where I think the Koisan chiefs, Professor Stanley's point is important. We're in a space where people are looking for both belonging, but also for ownership. For a very long time, they have been sidelined from ownership by structured racism and white supremacy. Now they're being offered ownership in very specific raced ways. So the broad-based Black economic empowerment has very deeply problematic notions of who is and who isn't an African. And one can understand that past dispositions must be redressed. But the fact that it is so unimaginative, that it sticks to the Population Registration Act 1950, and we are 30 years on from 1994, we now have millions of South Africans. In fact, the majority of people are younger than 1994. They were never classified in those terms, but they're being encouraged by state processes to identify themselves in processes that are 2 generations out of date from their own birth. We have built inequalities in the post-apartheid state by articulating race with global conceptions of race, right? So people in South Africa are not just understanding themselves in local terms, they're understanding themselves in global terms. And with the rise of white supremacy, with the rise of ethnic and ethnocentric ideas, of course, people will have, opportunists will use those discourses to call upon local people's economic insecurities, cultural insecurities, and constantly being told that they do not belong, they're not legitimate. Which, again, when people are threatened by, one, not having ownership because of the really awful neoliberal economy, and 2, not having a sense of belonging because nothing that they value is being visibly seen by them in their stores, why would they not, globally, we see this drift towards opportunistic, right-wing, ethnocentric, sort of politicians. And I think, again, it's not that I think people who wrestle with the term colored or its multiple other iterations are unique. This is the case for many South Africans. If you're a Siswati speaker, you will never see Siswati on a label for milk. You will not walk into a supermarket and see your language, in the pharmacy on the medicine. If you're an isiZulu speaker, you might see isiLezwe, you might see the Bible, you might hear it in soap operas, but you're certainly not going to see it in the pharmacy. You're not going to see it, on the ingredients list for the chakalaka that you buy. And so what we've done in post-apartheid South Africa is replicated the alienations, dispossessions of apartheid and colonial South Africa, and given it the legitimacy of saying to people, this is who you are, this is how the state reads you, so imagine yourself in these terms. And so I agree with Patrick that I think it's time, and for us to think of, to allow for people to think of new ways of understanding themselves that are productive, that are useful for them, and to give people those tools to do so. I mean, I'm thinking of Abdullah Ibrahim, the jazz pianist, who, in his 90s in Cape Town, who once said apartheid made white people mad because it made them believe that they were superior, but it also made everybody else mad because it asked of them to participate in public life as if that were true, even if they knew it wasn't. And to go back to Bessie Head, who left this country precisely because of this endless amounts of categorization, where she said there are so many signs and divisions that with all these signs and divisions, you end up with no people at all. And she said that what you need is new, we may need new names for human dignity because the old names are so steeped in those histories of dispossession, dehumanization, and animalization of ordinary people. And then the last thing I think is from Zoe Wickham, who in 1990, a writer writing about the Northern Cape, where she comes from, in a story called Another Story, talks about these terms that we inherited for ourselves and for one another as food in a refrigerator that's gone off. And if you don't clean out the refrigerator every now and again, that poisoned food, that rotten food, then starts tainting all the other things in that fridge that you have. And if one thinks of the last 30 years in South Africa, we've certainly seen that horrible mix of ethnocentrism, xenophobia, anti-Africanity among people whose only existence has ever been on this continent, really rot up other aspects of our lives, including economy, education, children's life chances, our senses of beauty, our senses of what really is who we are and what is the world that we live in. And I think that that needs to change radically and quickly. And we are running out of time.
There are some other aspects that we are obviously going to grapple with and talk about. And I've seen some comments which I'm going to put on the screen in a moment. Before I excuse you, Patrick, do you have any other thoughts or comments that you want to make before I allow you to go to your other appointment? And I'll ask the same of you, Stanley. Patrick?
This has been riveting. Thank you, Angela. Yes, I'm going to have to go, but maybe one other thing to think about is, we live in an age now where there is DNA testing, and it tells us some really fascinating things about who we are. We've got our social history, which I often talk about. We have genealogy, and South Africa is one of those places where they kept records, everything from sales of enslaved people through and on. But now you have DNA, and what DNA tells us about those of us who are classified as colored is that around about up to 42% of our DNA is associated with Southern African DNA, which generally is Koisan Mbuti peoples, but up to 36% of our DNA is associated with sub-Saharan Africans, Bantu-speaking peoples. So the difference between 36% and 42% is actually not much of a difference. We also have 20-odd% European, and we've got 11% South Asian and Southeast Asian. We are scientifically the most diverse population in the world in terms of our DNA. But how many people amongst those of us classified as colored will acknowledge that 36% of our DNA is associated with Bantu-speaking peoples? We either say that we are just Koisan or Koi or San, or we say that we are mixed or whatever. But this is the reality. And I think the spat that happened last week with the podcast and then Gayton McKenzie. And Gayton is a very interesting person because he's predominantly Sotho, but he projects as this colored identity, and there shouldn't be this contradiction. It's fine. I mean, I have Europeans. I have 8 Kwe in my family tree. I know all my ancestors for 400 years, and I have 28 people from other parts of Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia. My genealogy tells me that. My social history tells me that. And now DNA tells me that as well. We need to digest that. People keep saying, I hear this. I heard it during the apartheid days, and I hear it now from people within our communities classified as colored. They say that black people are aliens. Black people are refugees. There's all sorts of horrible terms that they use. But that black is part of us. The DNA tells us that. The genealogy tells us that. The social history tells us that. We've got to come to terms with this and understand it fully. In 1658, 402 children, enslaved children from West Africa, were brought to Cape Town when there were only 90 Europeans. We're descendants of those kids. And subsequent, 62% of the entire enslaved population, the first generation enslaved population, were Africans. Yet we talk about enslaved people as Malay slaves. That was a small minority of the enslaved population. So when we go into, and this is what I'm leaving you with, when we go into our real social history, when we go into our genealogies, when we go into our DNA, it's going to tell us something. And this is why we established the Kamisa Museum at the castle. It's a very different kind of museum to any other one, because it starts off with the question, who do you think you are? And then it introduces people, not to events and whatnot, to people in their 195 roots of origin that we have. I think that kind of thing has to become a discussion across the country. And it's not just a discussion for people who are classified as colored or who self-identify as colored. It's a conversation for those identified as black, because at the end of the day, they're also colored. If we go into Walter Sisulu's family history, into Winnie Mandela's family history, into Naledi Pandor's family history, there's a lot of constructive nonsense around the siloing. And that's what we got to deal with. And that's where I'm going to say goodbye.
You're going to leave us. I am so grateful for the time that you could spend with us to give us some historical context about roots, identity, these classifications, and when we were exposed to them, just so that those who do not know can at least go online, go find out, or go visit the Kamisa Museum. It's at the Cape of Good Hope, if I'm not mistaken.
It's at the castle, at the castle in Cape Town.
At the castle in Cape Town. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I appreciate your time. That was the historian and author Patrick Mellett. I don't know who of you are familiar with the book, The Lies of 1652, but he was touching on other aspects as well about classification. We're going to go say goodbye to Professor Stanley Peterson in a moment. I just want to hear your closing thoughts, and thank you for joining us and giving us the perspective of why some Koisan communities feel they cannot be called colored. And then I will allow Thomas to kind of give me his thoughts about what we've said so far, because you've been the quiet one so far, Thomas. I'm going to give you that in a moment. And welcome to everybody who's joined us online. Please drop in the comment section where you're listening from. I don't know if you are YouTube Live, if you are LinkedIn, or if you are watching us on Facebook. Just as a reminder, from what I understand, if you're on Facebook and you're commenting, I won't see those comments, but you're most welcome. If you are in the YouTube Live chat, you are welcome to share your comments and take issue respectfully with our guests. I'm going to put up your comments in a second. Crystal, hello. Ingrid, hello. Hinap, thank you for joining us. I saw moments with Jono. I'm going to reflect you in a moment. Ntombi, Fikile, thank you so much for joining us. Enslin, your opinion is noted. Terzel, psychological warfare, I see you too. So please feel free to share or comment or share your questions. Please let us remain respectful. We're talking about power, history, the political fault lines of specifically the colored community. If you missed our earlier guest, the author and historian Patrick Mellett, he was giving context of why we talk about colored communities. Very, very interesting. I'm sorry that you missed out on that. Your closing thoughts before I say goodbye to you, Stanley.
Yes, thank you, Lynette. You know, a few years ago, I launched the first case in South Africa of hate speech and discrimination against the Premier of the Northern Cape. We are from the same grouping. And in that case, you can read a case study because that case is a reference study. I was unemployed, and this is a major person that I took to court. I first went to the Human Rights Commission for 5 years, did nothing, and I took it to the Equality Court. Uh, that one is for the people outside there. You know, our history are being told by historians and everybody. That's things that's been recorded, but nobody did a research of what we told at that time. We read about other people writing about us, but not us telling the story. That's the one thing I want to finish off. The second one is my great grandmother. The people can research Lena Jantjies. She's the oldest person in South Africa. She died at the age of 139 years in a place called Nopoort. She was born in 17 April 1842 in Port Nolloth. And you see, we are a people. He's correct by saying we are not a nation, but we are a people. And I want us, everybody in South Africa, I will not say, for instance, you are say you are Kosa or you are Petty or whoever you are. That's your case. But don't tell me because I've got a right to self-identification. And for me, it's very important now for us. We are busy now to revive as the Koi and Son the issues. Previously, as I told you, we were nothing. But now with the rooibos levies that we received, we open up now Facebook pages, YouTube channels. We had our own newspaper, which is called the Inheemse Spoor, to tell our people our side, our stories, and who we are. And we are proud to be either one of the 5 nations. We are proud to be either Griqua, Nama, Korana, Cape Koi, or Sen. That is who we are. That is, and I want to encourage the people outside there. Be proud to be who you are. Remember when you drive a car, there's a big mirror in front of you and a small mirror. So don't look in the small mirror, always at the back. Look in front. But remember, soos hulle in Afrikaans sê, wie is jy? En you know your kom vandaan. Thank you, Lynette.
Thank you so much that you were able to join us this evening. I appreciate your availability, and I'm hoping that in the future we can talk about it again, and all the other aspects that you mentioned. That was Professor Stanley Peterser, and he was talking specifically about why Khoi and San and Nama communities do not call themselves and don't want to call themselves colored. So we are left with a political analyst now. Angelo Fick, Kelvin Knowles, and Thomas Tablanche. Thomas, I've said earlier that you were pretty quiet, but I'm keen to hear your thoughts before we move on to some of the other conversations that we do need to have. What we hear, the rhetoric of being caught in BEE and not feeling you don't benefit, the stigma and characterization that you are all gangsters, the nationalism that we see rising, where that comes from. So for the next hour or so, that's going to be our focus, and you are most welcome to comment and share your thoughts as our guests take us through some of these changes that we've been wrestling with. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for indulging us.
Yeah, no, thank you, Lynette. And of course, good evening to the fellow panelists, as well as the listeners and viewers on the different social media platforms. I think, of course, I agree with most of what my colleagues are saying about, the issues and the questions around coloredness, especially in this particular context. What does it mean to be colored? I think is the question that a lot of so-called coloreds are grappling with. Oftentimes, we don't have, of course, education, so we haven't been educated about what it means to be colored. We don't have the time. We're busy with, survival issues and survival, quite literally, sometimes in gang-infested areas. And so I think this period, and I'm glad Prof. Stanley has brought the conversation about what does it mean to be Khoi or San outside of the context of being colored. So I think the first comment that I would like to make in context to that is our zeitgeist. Currently and I know a lot of the people in the commentating class, so to speak, are against, and yeah, I'm not speaking for a political party, but they're against this national dialogue or this national convention. And so we've been, of course, in democratic South Africa for 30 years. We know we do have a history of conversation, the hotla, as it were, if we were to speak in Nguni people's culture, Bantu-speaking people's culture has always been part of, conversation. 1990 to 1994, of course, with Godesa. But there's never really been an opportunity for South Africans to come together, whether the platform that we've received or the womb, so to speak, where the conversation may be had is and possibly perceived as a corrupt or just a political exercise. I think it's important in this moment, in the zeitgeist, that we express what does it mean to be South African in the various identities that we find ourselves in. Now, Patrick already alluded to the fact that we have over 195 social identities. A lot of the identities that we understand today, or a lot of the identities that have been prescribed to so-called colored people, have been identities given by other groupings, and more particularly colonial groupings. So, of course, in the 1600s, the precursor to the term colored would be bastard. And this was part of sort of the social compact, so to speak, to use President Ramaphosa's terms, up until, of course, the 1950s, as we've already understood. And so for me, what does it mean to be colored? It means a people who never was, but a people who has always been. So we never were, because this term, whether it be bastard, whether it be colored, whether it be mixed race, was applied to people from other people. However, we've got this vast social identities. And so I think in this new context, and so I say that we've always been, because we've always had these 190 plus social identities within us, within our blood, within our genealogies, within our histories. And I think what pains people, and the statements that these young fellows had made a few weeks ago, I think it roots back to the three strategies that the colonial regimes have done on us. They've dehumanized us, they've disenfranchised us, and they've mischaracterized us. Now, for example, the Dutch East Indian Company, of course, we know the history, settles themselves here in the Cape. And they call the local people, local Khoi people, lazy. But there was a different type of an economy during that particular period. And so they call them lazy because they don't want to work for them, and they're not adhering to their laws, so to speak. And so that was a mischaracterization. Van Riebeeck speaks of these indigenous people being called barbaric, where his counterpart, I think his name is Prot, speaks of the local indigenous people as being people like us. And so those are the two different viewpoints, but the viewpoint that we understood since the 1652s was these people who were lazy, these people who weren't like us, these people who are barbaric. And so I think perhaps to close off my segment for this particular conversation, I think it's an important moment, and I think South Africans, whether the like I said, the womb of the environment in the so-called National Convention might come across as a money-wasting exercise and may not even be used by political parties. But I think it's important that South Africans use this opportunity, so-called colored people, use this opportunity 30 years into our democratic dispensation, to use this opportunity to self-identify and identify how we wish to identify, whether it be Khoi, whether it be colored. I think it's important that we do identify ourselves by our own terminologies, and whether or not we need historical training, whether or not we need new information. I think those things come with time.
I want us to obviously touch on other themes this evening and allow our viewers to participate. But I want to quickly acknowledge the response, the overwhelming response on this promo that I made, and I shared it with all three of you. Introducing this conversation tonight, and I'd really like you guys to make some notes of some of these views, because this is what we will be elaborating on and giving context to. So Manuel Mojo writes, this is mainly what I'm going to share with you is this responses on TikTok on the promo there announcing this conversation this evening. He says, and I quote, and I'm going to reference a lot of other opinions here and comments as well. I took ownership of this word, that nobody can use it as a derogatory term against me. Being colored is a mix of the world. We are the baseline for nations mixed with all and everyone, making our uniqueness something the world should strive for. Ons is gemix, but in our pot it's different spices to make this lekker flavor. Then another person says, yes, let's open this finally long been buried. Time is of the essence for this community. Another one says, this is long, Rocco, this is long overdue and should be at the forefront of driving these discussions. And there's a lot of praise for what the conversation promises. We are the original inhabitants, says Nello, of Southern Africa and need to be respected on our homeland. Far too long, our people have been oppressed and colonialized. Other one says smoke and mirrors. This is interesting because I do want us to talk about who benefits from these divisions that we see. Smoke and mirrors, writes Tariq. Crime is rampant, corruption cartels running the government. Another one says, let me try and continue. Thank you. Also invite our brothers from South Africa and America to watch. You all probably are familiar with the tensions between South Africa, the whole Tyler debate, because she identifies as colored and to them it's a derogatory term, and there's infighting. You can't keep up with all of that. I just want to reflect more of this. Tabiso says, I'm not trying to be ignorant or rude, but if open chats never insulted colored people, was this episode ever going to happen? Yes, indeed, because this is not the first time that these utterances have come about. This is not the first time that colored people have said, but we are not being recognized. KGS says, why is everyone still seeing themselves exactly as the old regime categorized us? We will never move forward until we break that. So if everyone is going to represent and focus on their people, no one is going to represent South Africa. That's some of the opinions. And then there's Trevor Krieger, racism and tribalism we suffer. 20 years ago, I said affirmative action and BEE are used to discriminate against brain mensa coloreds. AA demographics of local municipality should be used, but national demographics are used to apply racism and tribalism against brain mensa. A lot saying they're proudly colored. And then this is the biggest wake-up call pre-1994. Will it be the end? Just start new order? Will it start ground zero? Will it become today and tomorrow end of the road? That is Gary Haramson. Then I want to reflect this opinion here, and then we'll take it further. Colored people are not respected nor well represented in politics and government. If you don't fix that first, nothing will change, no matter how hard we try. The odds will forever be against them or us. Let's talk about that, Calvin. Let's talk about the perceptions that a lot of people say colored people say they feel invisible when it comes to economic advancement. When we talk about land, they say the stereotype is being fed that violence is synonymous with colored communities, and that's in the public discourse, that there is no honor, recognition given for the successes and the contribution that this colored communities have made to South Africa?
Yeah, no, most definitely. I just want to, because I've jotted down a lot of the comments as much as I could in terms of what you just read out now, so that I can respond to that. Certainly not all of them, but surely some of them. But I just want to say, or basically reiterate what I've attempted or endeavored to say earlier on in my opening remarks. What I've said essentially there when we started this conversation was that it's, for me, from my position, the talk is over. Patrick just gave us a nice and a very relevant, of course, the rich historical tapestry of origin, of history. A particular point, remark that he made for me was that the past has not passed, right? And Angelo, you spoke about being a child of 72, myself, that got conscientized in the 80s politically, and also in terms of our place in the struggle, and being very mindful and having at this point, and it's something personal. I don't think we can entirely divorce ourselves from our past in terms of what made us who we are, the way we think. So again, for me, grew up detesting the label of colored. That was a label that was put on me. So in terms of referring to myself and people like me, it would be largely, almost exclusively back in the 80s, then in the resistance politics, so-called colored, because you detested that.
Yes.
And along that, obviously in terms of where conscientizing came from, we look at, if we look at movements, the unity movement and the Congress Alliance and the UDF and all of those social movements that were active in our communities back then, that made us understand that this struggle that goes back so many years, of which Patrick now spoke of, and I mean, you also gave us some points there, Thomas. We believed in that, but at the moment, a lot of voices are going up and saying that the role of colored activists back in the resistance politics, they're not recognized. They're pushed to the sidelines and to the margins and all of that. I cannot believe, or I could not believe, that I would be talking about this, because when that struggle was fought, precisely against the things that this community is facing now, when that struggle was fought, it was fought with the ideal that we will be rid of it one day. But the lived reality of people on the ground, from them to make pronouncements such as, we are the forgotten people. And in Afrikaans, they use the word geëik. It's almost like it's been said so many times, that whole dictum of, we were not white enough, and we're not black enough now. And when you say that, you get a lot of reaction, when you make those assertions. But can we really not understand and accommodate people that cannot be culturally accommodated in the political setup that we have, that feels the disillusionment? Speaking from personal experience myself, and I'm not one to shy away. I've used the words like pussyfooting earlier on, to shy away from interrogating these issues, and yes, and running the risk actually of wearing my heart on my sleeve. But you cannot divorce the reality on the ground of what's happening in communities. Patrick mentioned social engineering. He said we must park it when he spoke. So we all know that the apartheid system was nothing else than just a brutal form of social engineering to subject people to draconian laws, racial laws. And talk about racial laws, there are so many, and he mentioned that. And we can go into that, we can discuss that. But for me, that past is very important to understand, because if we don't know where we're coming from, we will not understand where we're going, and we will not appreciate where we are. And when I say appreciate, I mean it taking cognizance or ownership of your unique place in the world, as Amy Cesar said, way back in 1956. As colored men, we've got a unique and peculiar place in society, and we must take ownership of that. So for me, romanticizing about the struggle was not going to do anything. People feel sold out. The idea of non-racialism, quite frankly, that we vehemently defended and believed in back then. There is no non-racism. The ANC, it's not the ruling party anymore. We know that is not non-racial. It is a deeply factionalized party. Besides, those are the internal doings. But it racialized this country to such an extent that we are so greatly racially polarized that we have, in the absence of cohesion in terms of people coming together, we have this, colored people, so-called colored people, understanding that if we do not stand together, who's going to talk for us? We saw this at the National Dialogue when the gentleman, Larry Varia, I might pronounce his name incorrectly, came onto the stage because at the last minute, apparently, I speak under correction, they were dropped. The invitation was revoked. So we're not part of the conversation. And who's going to make us part of this conversation? I personally, for myself, if a government has perpetuated what we tried so hard to escape from, you got to find new ways to make yourself heard. This is my take.
Thank you for that, and thank you for everybody that's commenting. I appreciate it, and reflecting where you are listening from. It really is important for us to gauge what you connect with in the conversation. I'm going to reflect some more of the comments. What you might not know is that I did invite Dr. Alan Busak to share his thoughts, because he said something very significant when he was observing all these changes. And he said that, and I quote, paraphrasing, that the ANC made him colored. And he had in the past often said that we should be careful and wary not to do this, where we allow what happened in the past to happen to us again now, that we are separated and segregated. Whereas there was a time that we did not look at ourselves in little boxes, and that has perpetuated, some of these laws have perpetuated that. So I just want to quickly reflect some more comments. Fact-colored areas in South Africa suffer from governmental neglect, facing inadequate access to clean water, sanitation and healthcare, along with safety concerns due to a lack of a police presence. Let's talk about BEE, because there is this feeling, and I think you touched on it, Calvin, that they feel invisible. Are they rightfully can claim that because of the laws and policies and the neglect, Angelo?
So if one thinks about broad-based economic empowerment, triple BEE, there's often the assumption that it has included all people that will fall under this category Black. But we know that that hasn't been the case. If you look at the details of those policies, it was to create 100 Black industrialists in a country of 62 million people. That there was always this assumption of trickle-down economics, which hasn't happened. And I think in focusing on communities we identify inside these categories and say, well, these people have been left behind, they're not included, we're failing to see what we can stand together on, where many of us multiply have been excluded. So if you're in Panyamanzane outside of Bombela in Mpumalanga, those people have been excluded from triple-based, broad black-based economic empowerment. The people of Kailicha are not included in triple BEE. The people of Motherwell are not included in BEE, nor are the people of Shorterville. But if we continue to think inside these ethnic categories, we forget to see how this division that we have set up means that we don't look at what it is we have in common, which is exclusion from a horrible economic system that uses race to distract us, right? So we constantly have to talk about how the state classifies us, and therefore those people over there get a service we don't get, when actually those people over there may also not be getting the service. And we need to be aware of government's failure across boundaries of division. If you're sitting in Mayanga and you're sitting in Manenberg, it's a railway line that separates you, but your safety and your children's safety have the same concerns. Cindy Remagona, a woman who every Saturday morning goes to the Langa community center to read to small children, had her bag stolen right outside of the police station in Manenberg. So this idea that some people are safer because they're Black, or some people are included in the economy because they're Black, is not borne out by what we see on the ground. But I think, people, their deprivation and their exclusion from processes of state must be acknowledged, because the state has in fact done this. But we also need to be aware that the state has not singled out only the so-called minority communities. It has failed 62 million people in this country. And we need to think of how we're going to hold the state accountable to serve 62 million people instead of wanting special rights. And here again, to go back to ownership and belonging. If we feel that we belong in the state, the dream has always been, and here for me, the terms, and I always grew up with the importance of using names, because names matter, and what we call things have consequences for what it is we imagine we're going to do to fix those things. Non-racialism is a dead end. It has been a dead end since the 1960s, and we knew this when, globally. Anti-racism was a far more powerful tool, which is why the Black Consciousness Movement in South Africa, the Black Power movement in the United States, and in the United Kingdom really worked very well, because it wasn't about just Black beauty or revaluing the things that were denigrated about Blackness and for Black people, broadly speaking. But it was about rethinking how we would think of ourselves outside of the terms laid down for us by the colonial gaze, by the white gaze. And so it was a liberatory project that I think we have failed to institute for millions of South Africans who have inherited horrible conceptions of the world that have nothing to do with how they should be living every day and how they could be living every day. We really should be giving our children better senses of imagination, so that, like me, growing up in a society that is totalitarian, I could go home and my parents could go, well, what they said in school is not true, and this is why it isn't true. But if we live in a country where 80% of 10-year-olds couldn't read for meaning between 2009 and now, right? That's 16 years. What does that mean for a population of 62 million people? That's a generation of people who can't make meaningful sense of things. And you often hear people say things that actually don't make sense, but they believe it and they have flung themselves onto it. This isn't possible. You've got the dates wrong, you've got the region wrong, you've got a variety of things that are actually not possible in recorded history, that don't exist. But you've clung onto this. And it's not just people who want to identify as colored, it's people who say they're Xhosa. isiXhosa is a language, but Xhosa people are a particular group of people who happen to speak isiXhosa, but they're not Abatembu. They're not Amatola. They're a variety of other things. And the same with people who speak isiZulu, Sepedi, Setswana. But we also have to ask ourselves, what languages have we learned in the last 30 years in this country as people who live here, right? Do we choose to continue to only communicate in English and the language that we see as ours, Afrikaans? Do we not learn? Do we not teach the languages that the rest of the country speaks? Are we not interested? I mean, I had to live in KwaZulu-Natal. I lived in Gundundlovu, teaching at the University of KwaZulu-Natal for 2 years. I had to learn isiZulu just to find out where the taxis are. And that sense of living in the Eastern Cape and having to learn isiXhosa because I lived in Gqeberha. Well, I lived in Ibai. It became Gqeberha after I left. What are the conditions we're making possible for ourselves and our children to offer a sense of belonging and being in this country? Because if we continue to invest that some languages really aren't worth hearing or listening to or reading, if some people's ways of understanding the world are illegitimate and they're backward and tribal, why would we be surprised that we are read in the same way by people? And this, again, to go back to Besihedi, is about understanding that hierarchies about existence, that some people are better, that we aspire to fairer skin or straighter hair, is something we need to unlearn and unteach ourselves. And that means understanding that race is a social construct, understanding that we live in a contemporary moment in this country. And so, yes, the history is important. We can't go back to a moment to rediscover some pre-colonial way of existing. We live in this world with its international supply chains, with the internet, with television. So when a young South African pop star who wants to make it in the US identifies in a particular way, and doesn't understand why that term is so deeply problematic in the market where she wishes to succeed, and in countries where people are going to buy her music, where she's going to get awards. That speaks to the failure of this society to articulate how that works globally, and also how it works on the continent. People in this country still say, we're going to Africa. And you want to go, where are you going to Africa from? You're going from South Africa, right? You're one of the two countries on the continent that have the continent's name in its terms. When we think of a generation ago now, when Thabo Mbeki and Shamil Jeppe brought Timbuktu to the castle of the Cape of Good Hope in order to reinvest the castle as a site not just of torture, but to rehabilitate it as a site where we can think of its relationship to Africa and our relationship to Africa. What did we do with that material? How do we rethink our own ancestry? We can go to Ahmed Davids, we can go to Tatamkula Africa. This idea that we don't have the material to make new ways of being in the world, that's simply not there. So we don't have to have government recognize us under the terms we have. What government has to recognize is its duty to provide us with the basics to make life. And so safety, security, the Bill of Rights, water, energy, the conditions for us to make our lives. So when a group of people who have a sacred history with the mouth of the Liesbeek River wishes to retain and reestablish their relationship with that particular area, we need to hold all three tiers of government, local, provincial, and national, accountable for suggesting that they will allow a multinational corporation that has no local taxpayer status, that will not bring real jobs to people with dignity, that will not result in local economic empowerment, access to that land to build their headquarters. And here I'm thinking of Amazon, right? But the same people who do this will happily then buy from that corporation something that they wish, whether it is a DVD or a streaming. So we need to realize that our current existence is implicated in global chains. And I use the chains very, very importantly because we're tied to this. We've become addicted to this, just like we've become addicted to categories. We want recognition from people who we really should not be looking for recognition from. We should be looking for them to do what they're paid to do, what we pay tax for them to do. And then if they have names for us, if those names have no matter, in other words, whether we get jobs, whether we get water, is not impacted by those names, then those names have no consequences. Think of the names that Black people have always had for white people. For a very long time, until 1990, 1992, those names did not matter, right? So if you go back to the Pan-Africanist People's Congress and their particular armed wing, the Heidelberg Massacre in Cape Town, and the spray painting of slogans, one settler, one bullet. And J.M. Coetzee, who analyzed the long history of terminology in South Africa, said what white people seemed to object to was not the murdering component of one settler, one bullet. It was being called settlers. Because for them, settlers were people in Kenya, not Kenya, Kenya. White people who came, lived, and left. And they were not settlers because while the term settler means to stay, in the discourse, its association is people who leave. But for the first time in South African history, what Black people called white people mattered, and that's what they were objecting to. They were used to having the power to name. What we need to get to a point is where these names shouldn't matter so that they will fall into disuse. Because names only remain in process if they matter, if they have consequences. And so if names continue to be insulting, you can only use them as insults if they are in fact consequent, right? They follow violence follows them, or dehumanization follows them. And if I'm in a class protected position, which I will admit I am, there are certain names which have no consequence for me. I'm not going to get a job. I'm not going to be denied entry to a hotel because somebody calls me that name. I'm very quickly going to be able to use their calling me that name to disempower them. But the majority of South Africans are not in that position. They're poor, they're peasants, they're rural, they're working class, they're unemployed. They don't have the education levels. They've been actively denied the literacy necessary to take that moment of definition and say, I am not that name. Which, to go back to something that was just said by Kevin a second ago, well, some minutes ago, because I tend to ramble, is that when we refused the names of apartheid South Africa, we didn't have the power to determine that the state must call us by the names that we wanted to be called by. But we continued to insist that we were not the name the state was using on us. Why is it that we now want the state to give us names? What is it that has changed? And it is again to go back to belonging and ownership. We've been signaled that we don't belong, all of us. Because if you're not wealthy and you're not in the middle class or in the political elite, you don't belong here. It's very easy to be dispossessed. You slip through the cracks and you disappear. And you've been told you own nothing, right? You don't have land, you don't have money, you don't have wealth. So people now cling to other things to give them a sense of belonging, and they want the state to say to them, you belong. Well, I don't want the state to give me a name, to give me a sense of belonging. I want the state to give me dignity, to meet my needs by providing water, by providing safe streets, schools where my children will be able to be properly educated, to make meaningful sense of their lives. And that is not what the state is doing. And that is a failure for all South Africans. Because to go back to Abdullah Ibrahim's point about how apartheid made white people mad, but it also made black people mad, post-apartheid has deprived even those who have of their true humanity. Because if you're a billionaire in this country, I don't care if you're the president of the republic, how do you live as a billionaire in a country where people have to collect their child's body from a school because it fell into a pit latrine? That is not a human life. That is a deeply, deeply damaged existence. How are you somebody who can, easily buy yourself a jet? How are you somebody who takes a bonus of 150 million rand, but the person who makes the money that allows you to get the 150 million rand, the cashier who sits on the till in that supermarket, cannot even take the change that the customer may leave on the counter for herself? That's the level of human indignity that we sit with. So I don't think what we need is just recognition of our names. We need recognition and provision of the conditions that make life possible, so that it doesn't matter what we call ourselves, and it certainly should have no consequence what somebody else calls me. If they call me by a name that I can continue to go into any shop, go into any hotel, go into any beach, then it makes no difference. Then the name itself will fall from disuse. It will fall into disuse because it will have no consequence. Names only remain when they have consequence.
I want us to quickly talk about the challenges that was raised in some of those text messages that I read earlier. Let's talk a little bit about present positioning and tensions. Most of you, and earlier on, Patrick did the same, spoke to it. But quickly, let's talk about the power and the political power, particularly about colored politics in South Africa. We've seen that they remain a minority swing, really at the center of political strategy, like makes it possible for either an ANC or the DA, if you look at the voting patterns, to be at the forefront or have governing power. I want to find out from you, Thomas, and Calvin as well, and I'm sure Angelo will share his thoughts. Have colored communities been exploited, the colored vote being exploited without really delivering transformation? Why and what has stood in the way of a colored community then, however you're identified as a grouping, not being at the forefront of leadership, of decision-making, close to the power, but not quite?
Well, yeah, if I may jump in there, I think that's a very fascinating question, Lynette. Well, I think the broad issue you are speaking to is so-called colored representation. And again, I suppose historically speaking, there have always been individuals or institutions who have spoken on behalf of so-called colored people, to use Kevin's terminology, which he had used earlier on. One thinks about, the mission institutions, the London Mission Society. Ian Kabeja, of course, has got a great history there with J.J. van der Kemp. We think of the George Schmidt, who came here in the 1600s as well, and would start the Moravian Church in Gennattensdal. Much later throughout history, and to bring it quite, of course, let's just run through history. into the early 20th century, you had colored franchise, a late 19th century so-called colored and black franchise in the Cape Colony, and then in the Union of South Africa from 1910 up until about the 1950s, where so-called colored individuals could vote, but had very minimal representation and was represented on behalf of by so-called Europeans, if we were to use the historically correct term, as they would call themselves. The leaders who were colored, many of them were non-racial, and however we wish to assume that particular terminology, or black consciousness in their thinking. Think of I.B. Tabata in the Unity movement. One thinks of, again, Dr. Alan Busak, leader of the UDF, Trevor Manuel, Neville Alexander, June Udemus, here, of course, here in Port Elizabeth and in the Cape, or Cape Town rather. Many of these leaders formed part of either the Black Consciousness movement, like I said, as well as the Unity movement, or the UDF for that matter. In the early 90s, you had Patricia de Lille, who was a Pan-Africanist, who represents, I forget the party, was it ID, who wasn't a
Good.
colored
And
party.
became good then.
Became DA and then became good a little bit later on. And so you had leaders, I think many so-called colored leaders who in principle weren't colored nationalists. Now we can debate whether or not we should have colored nationalism based on the so-called marginalization. But I think Angelo makes the point that everybody's suffering from this dispensation. Yes, we might not have crossed the line from the northern suburbs or northern areas to the eastern areas in New Brighton, Motherwell, where, of course, myself and Calvin are from, in Kabeja or Port Elizabeth, but the issues still remain the same. And so up until, I think, recently, you have colored nationalist parties who aren't as successful. Mackenzie's party, Gayton Mackenzie, who calls himself a multiracial party but has a colored constituency, and the National Colored Congress. I forget the leaders. Yeah, Adams, I think it is, and so they,
Final,
I suppose,
I think, I'm not mistaken.
yeah, and so there is, I suppose, in one instance, the colored vote has never really, yes, and I think John Henry gives another couple of names: Geraldine Fraser, Cheryl, Auntie Sophie de Bruyn, of course, again here from PE, and so the colored vote, in my just quick purview of history, very quickly, has never really been nationalist. If you were to look at the so-called colored nationalist parties, they've never really been successful. And if you were to look at the so-called colored leaders who rose through the ranks, colored nationalists, I mean, you mentioned Hendrikse. Hendrikse was really seen as a traitor by many. And of course, his Labour Party had failed quite successfully, thankfully for that. And so, yes, I think there is a certain degree of marginalization. Again, I think broadly speaking that the issues that so-called colored people in working class environments are facing are very similar to those Black and Indian individuals in so-called working class environments as well. And so I think we still have a long way to go. And to answer the question, I think most prominent colored leaders have been principally non-racialist or Black consciousness and have found themselves in liberation politics or neoliberal politics such as the Democratic Alliance, and probably most recently, quite interestingly enough, the Freedom Front Plus, was sort of pushed their narrative beyond just Afrikaner peoples, but beyond that. And so I think my last comment to make is that it would seem that in the South African context, every so-called racialized grouping has had its political party, except for Indian people, or Asian people, and colored people. Yes, we have the Minority Front in the KZN, which of course has failed, and the NCC with Fadil Adams and Gayton McKenzie's political party, who haven't done as successfully. But of course, one may debate the merits of that.
I want to ask, because you mentioned Patriotic Alliance, you've mentioned the Coloured Nationalist Group. Calvin, have these, because they did very well in the elections, has it been genuine empowerment, or has it watered down to ethnic mobilization? Like-minded people feeling, well, we all feel like this, so now we start a party.
Okay, so I'm going to try and answer it like this. So I just want to latch on to what Thomas just referred to now, just to put my sort of perspective on it. So there's definitive timeframes, obviously, in terms of so-called colored politics, or colored politics for that matter. Patrick spoke about the APO of 1902, for instance, and those three strands, Thomas, that you've sort of unearthed for us now. You talking about the issue of non-collaboration, primarily sort of coming out of the non-European unity movement, which is the precursor to the unity movement. And then we had the Congress Alliance, and then 83, 84, where the tricameralism, that came to the fore in terms of how those three strands shaped and formed colored politics, or influenced colored politics, and how they organize, and how that in turn, for me, influenced identity, whether that identity is influenced sort of culturally, religiously. I mean, Thomas spoke about that too. I know that's his forte as well. And then ultimately politically, again, it comes back for me personally is to how did all of these influences bring us to a point where a people is saying that this is how we feel. And I do understand, and obviously we cannot divorce ourselves from the greater populace, obviously. And when it comes to socioeconomic ills, we are all affected by it. And the incompetence of this government, as sort of Angelo's alluded to earlier, that indeed it is South Africans, as South Africans, we must hold this government accountable, obviously. But again, it should not stop us from interrogating issues such as socioeconomic deprivation through legislation, such as BE that we touched on, such as employment equity, that's got these racial quotas, that excludes people from the job market. And again, we can throw the net or cast the net out wide and say, yes, it affects everybody. But when it comes down to a people, lack of access to employment opportunities, it's going to have an impact in terms of crime, and all these other social ills that we find ourselves in. So that's the one thing I want to say. Now, in the absence of a definitive or a loud enough, let's rather use that term, of a loud enough voice that is not so much concerned about the academic. So, and that's why I said at the beginning, for people out there, it is not necessarily an academic exercise where we as analysts or as academics that write about these things and read about it, not, of course, saying that others do not, but it stepped down a level where people found the loudest voice. And those parties, you've rightfully referred to the Patriotic Alliance. And, a lot can be said about the party, where it finds itself now, where it came from, all that. For the ordinary person on the street of color, and we know Gayton McKenzie will say that obviously they're a party for everybody, but he admittedly also says that he predominantly represents the colored voice, hence, the PA going sort of and opening up a case against these podcasters, and no other party did that. I think the DA did it. I'm not so sure.
No,
the other voice
the narrative is that the DA jumped onto the bandwagon after the fact. Yeah. That's the narrative.
Now, in the bigger scheme of things, why did the EFF not do it? Why did the EFF not go forward and say, you are responsible for perpetuating these stereotypes, where you're labeling a people as incestuous and all of these negative things? They did not do it. So it's nuanced for me, and in the absence of a voice that's loud enough, that is where the PA is, and the NCC of Fadil Adams is capitalizing. Whether we agree with that, how they capitalize on it, is neither here nor there for me. people are feeling represented. They feel for once in a very long time that the voices are being heard. Whether there's a need for these voices to be converge, I don't know. But that's a topic surely for another discussion. But they feel heard, and they find expression within these parties more and more so. And we can question whether that's a good thing or not. If we question whether it's a good thing or not, what are we questioning? Are we questioning that people are finding a voice? Are we providing them with an alternative voice? What are we doing? Are we just talking, having a talk shop? Are we just having podcasts and talk about colored identity? So for people, they're not necessarily concerned about that. Yes, it's good to inform people about that and give them the background, all of that. I'm rambling now. But yeah, so that's what these parties are doing. They like in Afrikaans, they say, as it pap reën moet jy pap skep. So yeah. That discontent, they're capitalizing on the discontent.
Yeah, because that's where they feel represented and they feel that their issues are being addressed. And if it's not addressed, at least it is being voiced on a national platform, whether you agree with it or not. That is why people flock there. John Henry writes, Gator McKenzie and Fadil Adams are the only colored politicians ever to stand up for us. And that is a valid perception that exists, and we can't run away from it, whether we agree or not. But has it thus far really been transformative? Has it delivered on that transformation that was its a political ticket in a way, Angelo?
That's an interesting question to ask, because if you look at the actual numbers of people who voted for these parties in 2024, 330,000 votes, more or less, on the split ballots for the Patriotic Alliance, 37 to 40,000 people, right? That's in a population of 62 million people, and the total number of voters. If you go back to the tricameral parliament, which so many people now pretend they never voted for, they never participated in, 272,000 South Africans in 1983, with a much lower population, voted in the House of Representatives so-called coloured election in 1984, when the UDF was launched in August of 1983. So this idea that we've always been against apartheid, all of us together, is something that I also think is one of those historical myths, where people say, we toy-toyed, we were there, we fought. And you go, no, 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 no. The majority of South Africans try to make their lives. So this is not about suggesting that people were morally deficient for not being part of the liberation movement or the mass democratic movement. But this idea that everybody who lived in apartheid South Africa opposed apartheid South Africa, and the only people who implemented apartheid were white people, is to deny the realities of history. The 272,000 people who voted in the tricameral election of 1984 believed that Alan Hendrikse and a variety of other Labour Party members and the other parties were their representatives. They saw this as an opportunity. So for me, the analogy here is that 330,000 people saw the Patriotic Alliance as an opportunity, or the National Coloured Congress, or those Klein Karoo parties, and a variety of other spaces. That doesn't mean that they will not have to be accountable to themselves when these parties can't deliver. People made promises in the election campaigns that, as an informed person who understands the Constitution and representative democracy, you would have known they couldn't implement. Even if they won a clear majority of 50+1, they wouldn't be able to change the Constitution. That would require a 2/3 majority plus a 75% representation in both houses of parliament. And so here again, to go back to the literacy concerns, I think it is important to recognize that people have these feelings, but it's also important to intervene and give them better tools to use those feelings to have politically more productive outcomes, and to make sure that they have the internal, intellectual and spiritual tools to be able to resist the appeals that are so populist and so substanceless. We live in a world in which we are seeing the most powerful country on the planet militarily and economically descend into chaos because the majority of voters fell for what turns out to be a deeply white supremacist fascist agenda and believed that things were going to be much better for them right after that election. And in the United States, a lot of those people are discovering that quite the opposite is happening. things are worse off for them now, right? So in this country, we need to educate people so that they understand the present, not just in relation to the past, but in terms of what is going on in the present. We need to rescue this idea that it's okay for 80% of 10-year-olds not to be able to read for me in any language for 16 years in a row. We need to stop fetishizing this idea that, you know, a matric pass is enough. And that means community education. Are we having conversations with one another on buses, on taxis, in church groups, in Stokvels, in situations where we are social? Or do we continue to believe my opinion, right? Because in the mass democratic movement, you could have your opinion, and if you said it to somebody on a bus, a Golden Arrow bus, they would very quickly correct you if they thought you were wrong. Or they would think because you hold that opinion, you're a spy and you're trying to elicit something from them. We became very astute readers of one another, of the society we lived in, and how to make better sense of the lies we were being told. And that's under an apartheid education system, which, to go back to Patrick Millet's point, was a Christian nationalist system. It was a white supremacist Christian nationalist crime against humanity. We are letting go of opportunities. One, we need to unionize. We need to join trades unions when we have jobs so that we can talk to other people face to face and not hang out on platforms like this where we're listening to strangers like me. Because the people you live with will very quickly correct you on some of your misunderstandings, right? So that's important. We also need to correct one another. When people say things like, oh, we don't have water, but they have water. Have you been there? Have you seen what they do or do not have? Let's live in this country and stop listening to people on social media platforms. And it's ironic that I'm saying this now, so people should stop listening to me, who are perpetuating lies that when we go and check with our eyes, we can see that is not the case. Right. And so I think we also need to live in this material society, not just in what is being given to us on TikTok or on YouTube or on
I was about to say, this is why there was a response, because there were just these statements thrown about for relevance, which was unfounded, had no base, but brought about so many hidden pain points and stereotypes fed into that. I want to come back because I want us to wrap two things that we need to talk about. Let's quickly just touch on what Moments with Jono says. Greater coordination amongst colored political parties, movements, groups could significantly amplify their impact, consolidated voice, strategic influence, resource efficiency, and community trust. You now find, and you hear it, I hear it a lot on social media, that we need to come together, whoever identifies as colored, need to come together and speak in a unified voice. What future could that possibly then be and look like when that actually happens, Calvin? Because it seems that everybody's playing for the spot in the for the place in the spotlight to benefit themselves, and then add to that, who benefits the most when we focus on these divisions and we feed into that consistently?
Yeah, I'm going to try and respond to it like this.
Twofold.
Yeah, of course. Back in the 80s, you know, we've spoken a lot about tricameralism. And there, of course, the Labour Party predominantly, and of course, when it comes to the House of Delegates, you know, the parties such as the Minority Front of Rajbansi and all of that, they co-opted. So they did what we said, they worked the machinery of their own oppression. So they collaborated with the system. And that's why, Angela also spoke about it, it was a dismal failure, although they became part and parcel of tricameralism. You might wonder why I'm speaking about that. That was not the way to go. Because at that time, in that moment in time, those of us that stood outside the fold, that were campaigning for this tricameralism not to sort of get off the ground, we believed we are part of this liberation project. That did not necessarily materialize fully for a lot of people materially. So now, as I said, we have these voices. So again, and I'll refer back to my own writings. On LitNet, I wrote an opinion piece about having a bosperaat of some sort, agitating for colored movements, political parties to get together. It might not be a smooth sailing affair. It could be messy. And when you start talking along those lines, people tend to label you as reactionary. You're going against the grain of what we as South Africans or society as a whole should actually be agitating for. I suppose such as the national dialogue is trying to do now, where we get all South Africans together. But I've specifically said I'm going to move out of that zone of being labeled as reactionary, speaking about people in enclaves and saying, okay, we're going to have this so-called colored Post-apartheid, to trash these things out. I've also further agitated, and that's why I said it could be messy. And by that, by no means I'm indicating that it would, but it would necessarily also have some intellectual backing at the end of the day, so that it's not that loose. And it can only be a good thing, I think, where these voices can be consolidated. As I said, people can label it reactionary. It's neither here nor there for me.
Are you suggesting that if you then have a Bosberaad of sorts, that you only have people that identify as colored to come together, or am I misunderstanding you?
No, you're not misunderstanding it. If I can just say, so when people get together, you remember this whole thing about the moonshot pack, with the DA-led moonshot pack, whatever they used to call it, sort of it got a new name as it went on. So that was all the anti-ANC sort of pre-2024 sort of coalition that got together to keep them out of power. There's nothing wrong with that. That was around a particular motive that they had. When these parties that represent colored interests come together, they could potentially, and I mean, I'm not unrealistic. I mean, they will not necessarily change the constitution. We know that. I mean, that can't happen. But they could represent a coordinated shift in the consciousness of people, that when they work together and finding themselves where they are now, that things could start up. They could have bigger influence. So yeah, that is my take on it. They could sort of galvanize their influence when they have a concerted effort in terms of bringing sort of all these voices together from this community.
Before you,
we shouldn't demonize it. We shouldn't just say it's a bad thing. It's reactionary. Goes against the grain of everything.
Just before I give you an opportunity to wrap, Angelo, I want to hear your thoughts about what Calvin said. But Thomas, before we end, I don't know if you are as young as we think if you are. I just want to quickly touch on the younger generations, because we find that you have the older people that reminisce and say, well, they can identify with the struggle and what the UDF represented. And now you have the younger audiences who are the Liam Jacobson, etc. People actually referenced him, that they find they can recognize with him because they're a different era, different generation. Of the younger colored generation, are they reclaiming the past and what their parents have said, what colored pride was, or are they rejecting all these labels and recreating what they want going forward? Why don't we hear? There's a lot of excitement about Leon Jacobs and there's a lot of division also about him, but why aren't there enough younger voices? Those that inspired the movements and the mobilization that we saw in the 1980s.
Yeah, I suppose it's a really difficult question to respond to because the context, of course, matters. If you were to look at South African universities, for example, and SRC elections, well, of course, that's not a major litmus test to see where young people are within the political process. And of course, rooting back to your question again, young colored people. Now, I've been part of the university system for all my adult life. From the time I got into university, I served in the SRC and various structures within those institutions. And while still in my undergrad and my honors years, I was able to meet different so-called SRC leaders in different spaces around the country. So having said that, from a lived experience, so to speak, it would seem that young colored people are not interested, and again, this is just context, of course, aren't as interested in partisan politics, so to speak, as much as their counterparts. But that's, of course, not only for so-called colored people as well. Within the university structure, white people, white young people, Indian people, young people, also aren't as interested in partisan politics. If we were to look at the SRCs as one example, but that that's a discussion. I suppose we can put on ice, because that will take quite some time. And again, class also matters. The politics of a middle class person like myself, whose parents were both teachers, who was schooled in English medium schools, are totally different to the politics of what someone in the so-called colored townships would be facing. Now, again, a lived experience as someone who was born into a particular class. I had found myself working in what is considered the northern area, so-called former colored areas, for several years. Of course, I had family there, and so I would holiday there for every June or December, whatever it may be. And even in that context, there was a disenfranchisement. Again, speaking back to the sort of historical positioning of what so-called colored people were. And so the point was, why are we voting if voting will not make a difference anyway? And so I think that's where a lot of young colored people, especially within those environments. However, having said that, and I see, a lot of your guests here are commenting, or people are viewing comments, are saying that the rise of the PA and the rise of the NCC has given the so-called colored political voice again. And so I think they are, at least just from my general observation. Now, whether right or wrong, of course, people sit on different sides of the aisle, and we've heard that, and we, of course, accept that. But it would seem that an expression is being found in, especially the patriotic alliance. I'm not so well aware of the NCC, but there's a lot of young people. Liam Jacobs, of course, who's quite new to the PA, but nationally speaking as well, in the ANC, you won't find, in the Youth League, the leadership of the Youth League, you won't find any colored voice. In the Democratic Alliance, there's a few here and there, but you hardly find any political voice there or any voice in there. And so I think it would seem that there is a expression through the Patriotic Alliance, whether you like it or not. However, I've read through some of the stuff, and of course we go through, as political analysts, we do study what happens in Parliament, and it seems only one or two voices within the PA, are really giving strong political statements, and a lot of the other things seems to be just activism. So I think there's perhaps a need for political education, however that may come across or may be expressed. And so I think let me conclude there, and maybe add to further discussion. But the long and the short of it is that there is a disenfranchisement with a lot of young so-called colored people.
And we see it, and in fact, actually, it re-emphasizes what we see other older communities and groupings say and voice on social media, but also within organizations. It's a reflection of that. So let's wrap this evening. I said at the beginning that it's going to be a long discussion. I told all of you, make sure you've got water and that you are healthy, because we're not necessarily going to provide solutions, but it is important to reflect what is happening and what is being said, whether we agree with it or not. I think, Thomas, you mentioned earlier on that we do study and we do listen, and we don't necessarily have to agree, but you can't also profess to be equal, and you can't also say, well, yeah, it's there, but you don't actually address it. And I think this is probably why there is and why such a strong reaction on the TikTok promo and the others, even on YouTube, where people feel we can air it, whether you agree with it or not. I wanted you to wrap for us, because I think it's important that we look at the bigger picture, not necessarily providing solutions, but who benefits the most if we perpetuate and concentrate and focus too much on the divisions, Angelo, and what contributions can colored community or colored political parties, can they actually deliver going forward? Because if we continue with our silos, we are not building and we are not being seen. How do we then move to that and break down the construct that others labeled us with to build, not only just as a community or a political party, but as a South Africa, recognizing your place in it?
I think if we want to build one South Africa, we need to talk to one another. And while some of those conversations will happen among people like ourselves, we also have to have conversations with people we don't think are like ourselves, because we have much to learn about how other people experience the world in very many ways, very like ours. But for me, it's always follow the money. When people say, I speak for you and I speak with you and I'm taking your issues forward, ask yourself how much they're earning. A minister earns 2.6 million rand a year. An ordinary member of parliament earns 1.2 million rand a year of our money. You buy bubblegum, you pay VAT, it goes into the kitty, you pay their salary. You will go to school for 4 years to become a registered nurse. You might break even at 350 or 400,000. You will go to university to be an engineer. You'll be there for 5 years, 6 years. You might earn between 600 and 700 as starting. You need none of these qualifications to get into parliament, right? All you need to do is be popular, say to people the right things, and you can never deliver on any of those things because you're a minority party. And so we need to ask, if you say you're going to sit in this cabinet and you're going to make these remarks about how people are left out, you are inside the government of National Unity Coalition. You are sitting there with 2.6 million income a year. What are you doing inside this space? Are you any different from Alan Hendrikse? Are you any different from Amichandra Rajbansi in 1984, where they sat inside a system, got money, said they were speaking on behalf of us, and all of us said no? Well, not all of us, but many of us said no, that's illegitimate. You are compradors. You are quislings, to use a particular New Unity Movement phrase. We need to be aware that people will speak as if they're speaking with us and for us, and they go home on their 2.6 million salaries, and nothing changes for many of us. And so we need to be a little more savvy about trusting people on salaries that we will never earn, when we send our kids to schools to get them educated, to get jobs that they will never have. What we have in this country is a need to reimagine the political system, to reimagine what people who say they serve the public are willing to give up in order to save us. When you served in the United Democratic Front, you didn't get a salary. When you served in the mass democratic movements and Desmond Tutu marched at the front of those marches, he didn't issue statements only. He didn't just bemoan what was happening in Gugulethu, as so many of our clergy currently do, send out internet statements into my email inbox every day that they bemoan this and they bemoan that, but they're not at the front of those communities. We need to reincorporate that people who represent us must live with us. Our politicians must go to this, their kids must go to the same schools our kids go to. They must use the same transport we do. Because if they did, you wouldn't have a train service interrupted between Cape Town Central and Khayelitsha and Mayanga and Mitchell's Plain, Captain's Club. You would have a functioning train system. But because they don't, and they don't have to, they're not interested in fixing the problems that face us. And they will continue to speak to us and say to us, we'll fix it. They'll take their 2.6 million or their 1.2 million. They'll say they're speaking on behalf of people like us because we look alike, but we actually don't look alike. If I earn 1.2 million, it's an amount I've never earned in my life. I can promise you that. You can do audits on my lifestyle. Then I'm not speaking with you when you are earning 30,000 Rand a year, when you have relied on less money. So we need to start following the money. What do we have in common with other poor people like ourselves? What do we have in common with people who may not look like us, speak our languages, but what are we able to exchange with them? And how can we begin to think and reimagine a very different South Africa in which all of us have access to things, not because of the color of our skin, the language we speak, but because we have the human capacity to deliver on that. So whatever the betrayed promises of the last 30 years have been, we made the world we currently live in, we can unmake it. But that doesn't mean we fall for the next fake Tupperware salesperson who comes along. Somebody will promise you that this product can clean your baby, clean your engine, and also make your grass grow. And you know that that's not true. They will take your money, they will deliver this product in a nice golden bottle, and you will find that it can do none of those things. We need to reimagine the current system so that, as Liam pointed, sorry, not Liam, that's a terrible Freudian slip, as Thomas pointed out, young people are not alienated from the system. Why would you vote in a system where the people that you vote for then go to parliament, make lots of noise, take their salaries, and say appalling things? They go to airports to wait for the international stars to come back with their delightful prizes that they won on their own talent, and then want to grab those prizes and stand on camera holding the Grammy. And minister after minister continues to do this. This idea that these people get paid money we pay them and then make promises to us that they know they never have to deliver on because they're going to get the salary regardless. If somebody that worked for you did this repeatedly, you would stop believing them. You would fire them. You would stop paying them to clean your house if every time you came back, they haven't cleaned it. And so young people need to take possession, take ownership, and take a sense of belonging in South Africa. And sometimes that means some very uncomfortable truths about ourselves we have to face. We have to learn new languages we didn't think were worth learning. We have to take on new names we didn't think were worth taking on. We have to accept that other people have experiences that we may not know of and have to listen to them. But if all we want to do is be listened to and have no interest in listening to others, what we'll sit with is a country of silence where I only want to hear my own voice. I only want to hear it from people who look like me, who speak my language. And that is not the Republic of South Africa. You can go back to the 50s. You can read Phyllis Ntantala, A Life's Mosaic, who writes about living on property that was owned by my grandfather, right? Eureka Estate, who talks about, so if you look at those lists of people in the UDF, they come from all the language communities. They come from all of the pencil test failures and passes. They come from a variety of backgrounds. Why is it that we now want to rebuild an apartheid South Africa? Why do we want to be Verwoerd's stepchildren when we can be something completely different, when we can imagine a future that is entirely different from the horror of what the ANC has given us, but does not have to go back to what Verwoerd dreamed or what was going on in the 19th century? We really have the ability to give our children much better tools to make sense. That may mean people like me will have to let go and let people like Thomas take up the hatch and begin to imagine the world very differently.
Calvin, have we adequately touched on all the pain points that we have heard voiced in our communities this evening?
I think there's a lot more surely that can be spoken of, that we can talk about. But I want to conclude also by saying that there's nothing more for me in the spaces that I'm moving disheartening than the total lack of consciousness in terms of understanding that you are being fooled by people, rightfully, as Angelo says, that earn these exorbitant amounts of money, and you sheepishly follow them. You are working your own demise and you cannot even see it. That's in the bigger scheme of things. On the other side, or the flip side of the coin for me, is that yes, we need then the people, we need the right people in the right spaces to speak for parts of our community, the pockets that still feel that they are not seen, that they're not human enough. Because if they were allowed those platforms and if their issues were addressed with more seriousness, we would not have young freeborns that would label a people as criminals, drunkards, and incestuous. Thank you.
Thomas,
That's where I want to end.
anything you want to add before we close? I think we're going to leave it at that, because I can sense that what you are saying is how a lot of people felt on social media when they watched and heard and had to be secondary trauma of being called this and that, and knowing that it's not founded in truth. So I think that's where we'll leave it at. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this past 2 hours. If you only came in the second half or half an hour of this discussion, I would encourage you to go and listen to the start, rewatch this live broadcast, the stream. Either I will remove it on Facebook, because Facebook will in any case remove it, but watch it then on YouTube and participate, comment, take issue respectfully with what has been said. But I hope that if you have questions about where do you come from, why do you identify as whatever you identify as, go online and try and find out, do the DNS testing, and also the Kamisa, as Kamisa Online. I don't know what the complete website is, but we had author and historian Patrick Mellett earlier in the first segment of our discussion. And very, very interesting. And I would encourage you, if you didn't listen or you weren't here for the start of that conversation, that you please like, subscribe, and comment and engage and share that conversation. Thank you, Angelo. Thank you, Kelvin and Thomas, for being here the past 2 hours. I really appreciate your contributions. As always, very important to have new voices, new perspectives, and for these conversations to be had. Much appreciated. Have a good evening. Let me kick them out of the studio and thank them for their time. Actually, Thomas is in the Netherlands, and he joined us from there, and we just had to make sure that the timelines were the same. And thank you so much, Angelo. Angelo is recovering. He's a healing man. He's recovering from illness, but he says he's much better and he was able to participate. We earlier this evening had Patrick Mellett. He's a historian and author. You might know his one book, The Lies of 1652, highly recommended. And we also had Professor Stanley Peterson, who was speaking on behalf of our First Nations. He said that, and he explained why they cannot consider themselves to be colored. And he gave his opinion and backgrounds to that. But I want to encourage and urge you to go and listen to the first part if you missed it. Thanks to everybody. Identify as a human, says XRP Bandit. Thanks, everybody, for participating. Your comments are much appreciated. Thanks for sharing the live and liking the live. Thank you for the likes. I see 30 of them. It really helps the channel to grow, and it signals to the algorithm that what's happening on Amplify with Lynette is worth talking about, worth participating, worth seeing, and worth amplifying the voices and the issues that affect us all. So I really appreciate it, and I thank you for your time. I mean, 2 hours is not how long. So just know that I do. And thank you also for all the participation on YouTube, on Facebook, and on TikTok. Much appreciated. Have a fabulous week ahead. This is only the beginning. More talk